History doesn't forget. It waits, sometimes for decades. Before the missiles of 2026, before the threats and the headlines, there was a quiet decision made in secret rooms, one that neither side ever truly moved on from. That's the problem. This isn't just a conflict, it's a memory that keeps reliving itself. A chain of cause and reaction stretching across generations, where each side inherits not just history, but grievance. Iran didn't wake up one day and decide to hate America. That would be too simple. This story starts with something more dangerous than anger. It starts with humiliation. A nation watching its own future rewritten by outsiders. A leader removed, a system replaced, and a message sent clearly. You don't decide your destiny. We do. Even as the rest of the world moved forward, that moment stayed embedded in Iran's political identity. Nations don't forget experiences like that. They build around them. They teach them. They pass them down until they become more than history. They become belief. Then came the revolution, and this time it wasn't quiet. It wasn't just political, it was emotional. It was about reclaiming pride, reclaiming control, reclaiming identity. When the United States lost its influence overnight, it didn't just lose an ally. It lost leverage in a region that suddenly became unpredictable. And from that point on, both sides stopped seeing each other as partners. They saw threats, not temporary threats, but permanent ones. And once that shift happens, everything changes. Every action is interpreted through suspicion. Every silence feels strategic. Every move feels intentional, even when it isn't. There was never a formal war for decades, but there was never peace either. What existed instead was something more complex, a silent conflict. Sanctions that slowly tightened economic pressure, not in explosive moments, but in long, grinding pressure that reshaped daily life. Covert operations that rarely made headlines, but altered realities behind the scenes. Strategic alliances forming quietly, expanding influence without direct confrontation. It was a war without declaration, and because it was never openly fought, it was never resolved. In that silence, mistrust didn't fade. It matured. It became structural. Then came what looked like a turning point. Agreements were signed. Promises were exchanged. For a brief moment, it seemed like both sides were stepping away from confrontation, choosing restraint over escalation. But they weren't stepping away. They were watching each other more closely than ever, because neither side trusted the other enough to relax. So even in moments labeled as peace, both were preparing for the possibility that it wouldn't last. And when those agreements eventually collapsed, it didn't create new tension. It confirmed what both sides already suspected, that the conflict was only being managed, not solved. This is where the conflict becomes more dangerous. Neither side believed they were escalating. They believed they were responding. A strike becomes retaliation. Retaliation becomes defense. Defense becomes justification. Each side builds a narrative where they are reacting to aggression, never initiating it. And that is how escalation hides itself. Not as a decision, but as a sequence. A chain reaction where responsibility becomes blurred. Where both sides can say with conviction, "We didn't start this." By the mid-2020s, everything was fragile. Diplomacy still existed, but it was strained and inconsistent. Talks were happening in formal settings, but outside those rooms, pressure continued to build. Military positioning increased. Rhetoric sharpened. Lines were tested repeatedly. The balance wasn't broken by one major event, but by a series of smaller decisions, each one pushing limits just slightly further than before, until eventually those limits stopped existing. And when there are no limits, There are no barriers left to prevent conflict. By 2026, this was no longer about avoiding war. It was about positioning for it. For years, both sides have been preparing for a scenario they insisted they didn't want. But preparation has a consequence. The more you prepare for something, the more acceptable it becomes. The more realistic it feels. Until eventually, it stops being unthinkable. War didn't suddenly begin. It became normalized in strategy, embedded in planning, and inevitable in outcome. If you step back, a pattern becomes clear. Every attempt at peace was built on distrust. Every escalation was framed as defense. Every side believed it was reacting, not provoking. And because of that, the conflict never truly paused. It only shifted form. From political to economic, from economic to covert, from covert to military. The surface changed, but the tension underneath remained constant. And then, when the war finally arrived, it didn't feel sudden. It felt like the final stage of something long in motion. Like a buildup reaching its natural conclusion. Not a shock, but a release. A moment where everything that had been building quietly could no longer be contained. So the real question isn't how this happened. The real question is why it was allowed to continue for so long. Why every opportunity to reset was instead used to reinforce old suspicions. Why history was remembered but never resolved. Because if there is one consistent lesson in all of this, it is this. Unresolved conflict doesn't disappear. It adapts. It waits. It finds new ways to express itself. And if nothing fundamentally changes, it doesn't end with one war. It begins again. You've been watching Yesterday Explained. Like, comment, share, and subscribe for more. Bye for now.